Welcome to the COVID-19 Road to Vaccine podcast. I guess that's what we're going to call it. I think, right, Dr. Eberlein, that's what we're going to call it?
That seems reasonable, yeah.
All right. Well, I put the time in making the slides, so we're just going to make that the title. Thanks for those that are taking the time to watch this, both within our large EMS system and also those outside of our EMS system. So because there are people that might join us or might watch this from outside our EMS system, Dr. Eberlein, could you introduce yourself?
I sure will. Thanks, Nick. So my name is Crosse Eberlein. I'm an emergency medicine physician at Gundersen Health System in La Crosse, Wisconsin. My background prior to being a physician is in biochemistry. And today we're going to hopefully do some education and help you to make an informed decision about the COVID-19 vaccine.
Perfect. And not only are you an EMS or ER physician, you're an EMS physician and our medical director for Gundersen Tri-State Ambulance and how many other agencies?
Approximately 50 first responder and some other transport agencies.
Yeah, so lots of different services that are under Dr. Eberlein's medical direction, and we certainly appreciate him taking the time to talk with us about this upcoming COVID-19 vaccine. I'm Nick Eastman. I'm the program manager of clinical services with Gundersen Tri-State Ambulance. That title doesn't really say what I do. I basically oversee education and quality within the organization, and in some circumstances, the EMS system as well. I've been a paramedic for 15 years, and I've learned a lot about vaccines in the last couple of days. So happy to be joining Dr. Eberlein as kind of a co-host here. So let's talk about the upcoming, actually, let's start with a conversation about viruses, because COVID-19 is a virus, and I think to understand the vaccine and how it is going to work against the virus, we should talk a little bit about viruses themselves.
I think that's a good place to start. So viruses are neither living nor dead, have no response to stimuli, and they require a host cell because they don't have any of their own metabolic machinery. They basically are a small segment of RNA or DNA. In this case, with the coronavirus that we're really talking about, it's RNA. And it requires that host cell to do all of its replication. And their whole purpose, these viruses, as I mentioned, they don't have any response to anything. Their whole purpose is just to replicate. And unfortunately, when they replicate in our cells, it causes damage to our cells, and in this case, the respiratory tract and the inflammatory process that goes along with that, causing all the illness that's associated with COVID-19.
So this information is nothing new then, right? Viruses have been in existence forever, and we've known about them for a very, very long time. And so this isn't new information to us.
This is nothing new. This is just another one of the many viruses that are in existence that we even know about. There's lots that we don't even know about yet.
Sure. And so moving on to vaccines, because we've known about viruses for a very long time, there's been attempts at making and successes at making vaccines, and even not necessarily vaccines in the sense that we think about today, the injection and that kind of thing, but efforts to protect humans from viruses through various methods for many, many years and even hundreds of years.
That's correct. We have had, in the literature, looking back, 1796, they started using cowpox material to create immunity to smallpox. Honestly, vaccines through our history have, in the last 200 years, have saved hundreds of millions of lives, if not billions, from our efforts with vaccination. It is truly one of the greatest accomplishments of medicine. And, this is nothing new as far as how our immune system will respond to an antigen. And that's the whole goal. Our goal of the vaccine is to prime your immune system so it recognizes this pathogen.
And do you think that in the world today that because we really haven't faced a significant illness, the flu can be significant for some people. And when I think of vaccines, to me, that's the one that pops up into my head right away. but there's been many vaccinations that we've acquired just through our normal lives, but then in EMS too with hepatitis and those kinds of things. Do you think that because there hasn't been illnesses that have been prevalent in communities, in most communities at least, that are partly due to vaccination, that we've kind of forgotten about the importance of vaccines because we don't see the positive effects of vaccines because they've just always been there for most of us?
I think that's a very good point. And I think when you look back in history, if you talk with some of the older generations and their experience with some of these illnesses that we no longer even think about, whether it be polio or smallpox, it was really life and society changing when these vaccines came on the market. And as you mentioned lately, we get our childhood immunizations. When's the last time someone saw measles, rubella? These things are just not commonly seen, in part, in fact, because we have vaccines against these pathogens. And as we go through time here, like you mentioned, we have not really had anything like COVID-19 that has come up. We've had the seasonal flu, and a lot of people's experience with the flu vaccine has not been great. Its efficacy, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is only 40%, and that's pretty low. So a 40% protection rate is not real good. And then a lot of people still get the flu because of that, so they don't think the vaccine helped them at all. So that has been our recent experience with vaccines, and I think that is some of the reluctance why people are not, or some of their reluctance to get the new vaccine.
Sure. Okay. So the development process for vaccines is certainly has come up in questions about this vaccine, the upcoming COVID-19 vaccines, and just in a general sense, why or how has a vaccine traditionally been made?
So traditionally, you had to take years, and you would isolate the virus, and then you'd end up growing the virus, typically in like a chicken egg, and then you'd separate the virus, and you would have to weaken or kill the virus, but to a point where it was still stable enough to be transported and then injected into the human body. And then our immune system would ultimately recognize certain proteins on the surface of that virus and mount our immune response to it. And that was one of the problems with the flu vaccine, why we've needed a new flu vaccine every year, is because we tended to make antibodies towards surface proteins on that influenza virus that would change frequently. And so you ended up having to get a new vaccine every year because we were not making antibodies to the real stable areas of that, of the influenza virus, because it did a good job of mutating and hiding the area that we really need antibodies towards.
Sure. And with COVID-19, the area that we're targeting, and I don't think we talk about it at all later, is the spike protein, which is a really integral part of this virus, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So you've got the spike protein, which is necessary for the COVID-19 virus to actually infect our cells. And so if you can make an antibody to that, one, it flags the COVID-19 virus to be destroyed. And two, once the antibody's on it, it can't infect your own cells.
And so if we think about it from a paramedic's perspective, this vaccine, I think of it a little bit like Narcan or something like that, that is competing for that receptor. And in this case, the vaccine is actually destroying the piece of the virus that connects to the receptor. So it's similar to Narcan in that way that it prevents that virus from actually attaching to the receptor, in this case, the cell, and getting into the cell.
That's right. And by inhibiting that virus from connecting to the cell and getting into the cell, it prevents it from infecting the cell. And then if it can't get in the cell, it can't use the cell's machinery to make more of itself. And then it's done. That's done.
All right. So what you described with the development of vaccines has really been the traditional sense, but big in the news now is with this Pfizer vaccine is an mRNA vaccine. What is an mRNA vaccine, and is it something we should be concerned about, that it's something that most of us have not heard of before?
Well, honestly, I think this vaccine type is much less concerning than the prior, and we'll tell you why right now. So, as we mentioned before, a lot of the prior vaccines were inactivated or weakened prior other viruses, whereas the messenger RNA vaccine, how that works is that in your DNA, or in your nucleus of your cells, you have DNA, and then you make messenger RNA off of that DNA that's transported into the cytoplasm outside the nucleus. And messenger RNA is different than DNA, so it cannot reincorporate into your DNA. And that's important because a lot of people were concerned that this viral DNA would get into your DNA, and that is not something that would happen. And then once it's in the cytoplasm, it is made into the protein. So what we're doing with this is we're taking this messenger RNA and we are bringing it into the cell using the cell's machinery to make just that small area of protein, that spike protein. That is the only part that is encoded that we are actually making this vaccine to. And by doing that, you don't have the rest of the DNA of the virus, or the RNA, I'm sorry. And so the rest of the virus isn't in this vaccine. It's just that protein. And by doing that, then your cells make that protein, for which you then also make the antibodies. And so it's really triggering your own body to make that protein that you will respond to. And the trick with this has been, in the past, messenger RNA in general is extremely unstable. And so they have talked about doing this for 30 plus years because this is a great way to do vaccines. But the problem is with the instability of messenger RNA, you just didn't have that process. One, it was too unstable to transport. And then when you injected it, free messenger RNA out in your interstitial space where your injection first goes gets destroyed. It just doesn't last long. So only recently we've been able to stabilize that by adding lipids to it and other proteins that are carrier molecules, so that way it's stable enough to be produced, transported, and stable enough, and also it allows it to be taken up by your cells, because free messenger RNA is not typically taken up by the cell.
Interesting. And one of the things that I had found while I was looking at the history of mRNA vaccines and drugs, because they really have been researching both, not just the vaccines for preventative measures, but also for use of mRNA as a therapeutic. But one of the interesting things that I found was that the first positive result from the use of mRNA was actually at the University of Wisconsin, of all places. And I think that was in the early 90s, like maybe 1990 or 1991. So it has a little bit of a close to home feeling. And then also, actually, if we think about the Pfizer vaccine, it's going to be stored and distributed either from Kalamazoo, Michigan, or Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. So a couple of local things about the vaccine here. So we kind of already covered the fact that this is not like traditional vaccines. There is no pathogen, whereas previous vaccines, you were injecting a weakened or dead version of the virus, let's say. This is not that. The storage concerns, technology in the last 30 years has improved. And so, not just the development of the vaccine itself, but also the ability to transport it, like you said. And there's some novel methods of administration out there that are very interesting with, microneedles and all sorts of very interesting things that I don't think we're going to get into, but lots of interesting information out there about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And go Badgers. As a Badger alum, I just got to say go Badgers on that one, because, great universities. That's my plug for UW-Madison.
So we can't share this across the border with our Minnesota friends anymore. So I wanted to talk a little bit about vaccine trials in general. And so I'd like to just walk us through what the process of a vaccine trial looks like so that we can then shift to looking at that same process in context of the Pfizer vaccine. And I want to make sure that we didn't do this in the beginning, but we probably should do it. I have no disclosures. I certainly don't work for Pfizer, or any. I have no financial interest in this at all. Dr. Eberlein, do you?
I do not. No, I do not. I work for Gundersen Health System, and that's so no other disclosures.
Okay. And the reason why we're focusing on the Pfizer vaccine, I think I said it already, but I just want to make very clear, is because it was the first vaccine to really look like it was going to be the one that would be available to healthcare workers, specifically to our EMS system, and we wanted to get as much information out about it as possible. So we're not saying that the Pfizer vaccine is any better than any other vaccine. It's just the one that we focused our attention on, and is actually going to probably be very similar to the Moderna one, because I think that's also an mRNA vaccine. So,
yeah, that's correct. In fact, everything up until this point would apply to the Moderna vaccine as well. And so, and as you mentioned, the only reason we're going to talk about the trial for the Pfizer vaccine is because it looks like that is going to be the most likely one that we're going to get. And the trial outline that Nick's going to go through here is the same sort of process that they would have done with any other vaccine.
Right. So the vaccine trials basically start with a preclinical phase where they, during that time, they're determining dose ranges. So they actually will create a vaccine candidate, in some cases multiple, but typically a vaccine candidate, and they'll give several different doses or create several different doses that they hypothesize would be effective. They may use lab animals at this point to determine safety, the immediate safety concerns. So preclinical is really focused on that ranges, the dose ranges, the route. Usually when you think of vaccine, you think of just a simple injection, but like I said, technology has changed. It's not just a needle injection. There's a lot of different ways to inject vaccines now, or to get vaccines into you. And then they may use the lab animals to help with that determination. Then they move to a phase 1, where again, they're assessing safety, and they're also assessing the immune response specifically in healthy people. So they choose healthy humans to receive the vaccine candidate. And basically they're doing their initial due diligence to determine if it's safe and effective. They start with the smaller doses, and then if those are proven safe, then they can move to that higher dose to try to find out then which is going to have the best safety and efficacy profile. So let's say they chose, a company chooses 3 different doses, and they start with the smallest one. It's safe, and it's safe. Then they'll move to that second higher dose, and if that's safe, then they'll do the third higher dose, and then they figure out which one of those 3 had the greatest safety and efficacy, and then they'll typically move that one to phase 2, which is a larger group of people, so more healthy volunteers. This is typically now getting to the point of hundreds of participants. And the goal here is to determine if there's reactions amongst a more diverse set of humans. So they may be healthy, but they're more diverse. If everything looks good there, then it moves into phase 3. And in a lot of data sets, it seems that like phase 2 and phase 3 kind of get stuck together. So you'll see that in upcoming slides where it talks about phase 1 and then going into phase 2/3. Really because phase 3 is a continuation of phase 2, but just on a much larger scale. And so here, the researchers are looking into monitoring toxicity levels. They're looking for the immunity response, and they're certainly looking for any serious adverse events. And as has been in the news with some of the vaccine candidates, there have been severe adverse events. Now, the big question then for the researchers is to try to determine the likelihood that that adverse event was actually caused by the vaccine and wasn't just a coincidence. And so, that'll be information that'll be continued to be reviewed over the next several months and even probably years. In this phase 3 section, that's really where we get down into, is this vaccine safe? and is it effective? And this can be a very long process, but within that very long process, they have interim reviews. So they'll, it may be a 2-year study, but at 3 months, they're going to look at the data. And then at 6 months, they'll look at the data. And we'll see actually that's what has happened with this Pfizer vaccine is the interim review of data showed really, really good results. And that's how we're moving forward with it. Now, there is a phase 4, and that's basically just an ongoing monitoring of the situation. So they're continuing to collect information on a continuous basis, looking for vaccine usage, adverse events, long-term immunity, all sorts of additional data that would be relevant to the vaccine itself. Now, when we get into the phase 1 of the Pfizer vaccine, what it really boils down to is that they created 13 groups of 15 participants each. And in those groups, 12 of the 15 participants got the vaccine and 3 got the placebo. And after determining the appropriate dose, or after looking at the numbers, they determined that the mid dose was the most appropriate. And the results, even in phase 1, actually, were looking pretty positive. So they found 3.8 times more antibodies, and that might be a little bit for dummies, the way I'm saying that. They used a much larger term, immunogenicity, but basically, GMT. So 3.8 times the geometric mean titers of antibodies versus patients who had COVID-19 already. So convalescent patients that had COVID-19 in that 55 range.
Nick, I think that's really important too, because this actually is giving you better protection than had you actually had the virus itself.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. So if you're between 18 and 55, these numbers are showing you'd have almost 4 times the protection than if you had COVID-19 previously. And if you're 65 to 85, it was 1.6 times the protection with mild to moderate fever in less than 20% of patients, or participants. So the safety profile was very good, and the efficacy, at least in that small group, appeared to be very good. And anything to add on the data here from the Pfizer phase 1?
No, and the one thing to notice, they call it an adverse effect, even if you have mild to moderate fever or body aches. But these are all really expected from a immune response to a pathogen. And so when your body is starting to make these spike proteins, your immune system is treating it initially like the coronavirus, and that's the goal. So you mount that immune response, so you make the antibodies. And associated with that is oftentimes the body aches and fever that we've all experienced. Basically, anytime we've been sick fighting a virus, this is the response your body does.
Perfect. Well, from there, they moved into phase 2 and then eventually morphed into phase 3. So this was scheduled for 2 years. And if you look up you can look it up online. You can see the submission that actually, and we keep saying Pfizer, but I think it's worth mentioning that there's another company involved, BioNTech, which might have actually been more so the purveyor of the initial technology and partnered with Pfizer. But it's a 2-year study, and phase 2 started enrolling participants in July of 2020. So this started, the actual research and development started before July 2020, but that's when phase 2 kicked off. And it initially included only participants that were over the age of 18. Now, since then, because of the safety profile, they started including participants 16 and older in September and 12 and older in October, which is very interesting. And we talked a little bit, Dr. Eberlein, prior to today about why it's important for this vaccine for adults, whereas if we were maybe several years back talking about an H1N1 vaccine, we might have been actually looking more so at, is it good for kids, because they seem to be more effective.
Yeah, that's right. And with this one, typically it's not uncommon to start with adults because they're easily consented versus children too. So an IRB, a research review board, is going to make sure that that it's safe because of that as well. But as they've noticed the safety profile of these vaccines, they've been able to lower the age range that they're given this.
Sure. And so, the thing that's been in the news for the last couple of weeks has been the data that Pfizer presented or had gathered and then presented based on their interim analysis. So, normal part of the process for any vaccine is to review the data somewhere during that study. And that happened here in November. And it was very positive. In fact, it was much better than had been expected and way above the benchmark that had been set, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So Pfizer then petitioned the FDA for an emergency use authorization. And I think we talk a little bit more about EUAs later. No, actually, this is where I want to talk about it. So what this basically does, an EUA request, it asks the government to review the product or whatever drug, vaccine, quicker than they normally would. They would shorten the time frame that it would take for them to actually get to it, but they still do the proper and same due diligence that they always do. Rather than prioritizing it amongst the, many other things, it gets moved to the top. And there essentially has to be a public health order, or there has to be a very compelling reason for the FDA to even entertain an EUA. What I thought was very interesting is that there have been 24 EUAs this year alone for COVID-related uses. And that includes things like an IV pumps. There's actually, I think it was Baxter, got an EUA for an IV pump because of COVID-19. Face masks, just your standard surgical masks. There's been an EUA issued for those. And there's actually been an EUA issued for an Impella device because we know that COVID-19 is causing issues with clotting and that kind of thing. And what's happening is they saw a huge spike in people needing right ventricular support because of COVID-19. And a company submitted an EUA request for one of their devices to help those people, and they got it. So EUAs aren't brand new. Again, this is not something that has never been done before. And in fact, it's been done many times already this year just for this health order. And something we learned today is that the United Kingdom actually has approved their version of an EUA for the Pfizer vaccine. So today, the United Kingdom approved the Pfizer vaccine in use in their citizens. So this isn't, again, just a how do we say this? Big pharma and big government working together.
Exactly. Yeah. It's, a whole nother, their version of the FDA has already reviewed all this, and they've deemed it appropriate for their version of an EUA.
Sure. So talking a little bit more about the process, the study actually had 100 and I think it was over 140 sites around the world. So it wasn't just American hospitals or clinics or that kind of thing. It was sites all over the world, which helps to enroll that diverse population to make sure that it is safe and effective in all sorts of people. And then each site has a principal investigator. So they have one person who's independent, actually, of Pfizer or BioNTech that are overseeing that performance and data collection in that site. And then there is a lead principal investigator who is an American physician, Dr. Stephen Thomas, who is part of the State University of New York upstate system. He's an infectious disease physician, and he's the lead principal investigator. So he then actually helps to take in all of the worldwide data. He helps to compile and review that to ultimately come out with the data sets that we've seen. So it's a worldwide effort with close to home lead, I guess. Also looking at this phase 2-3 trial, there's up to this point have been nearly 44,000 participants, and half of those people got the vaccine and half got essentially a normal saline injection. Now, what makes this a more credible study, would you say, Dr. Eberlein, is that it was blinded, it's double blinded.
This is your gold standard double blinded study. Absolutely.
And so what does double blinded mean?
Means neither the patient or the person giving the shot or following it at that time knows whether or not you got the placebo. So they treat everyone the same. So only the researchers at the other end will know. Yeah.
So imagine, it would be like being behind that mirrored glass, that the people in one room have no idea that, that others are watching. And in this case, and they're clueless to what maybe the other people are watching for. In this case, the recipient of the injection and the person doing the injection have no idea if it's vaccine or placebo. Only the people that have access to the data that are not involved directly have that. And that's that external review board or independent review board, IRB, that has access to that information. So of those 44,000 people, 170 up to this point, and this I think was, I don't know if they've released any additional data, but as of like last week, I think it was 170 of those 44,000 people had actually tested positive for COVID-19 after receiving the injection. 162 of those 170 were in the placebo group, so they did not get the vaccine. Only 8 of those 170 were from the vaccine group. They also released information about the severity of the illness. So of those 170 people that got it, only 10 had severe COVID-19, and only 1 of those were in the vaccine group. So that's important information to not only know about the likelihood of getting COVID-19, but also the likelihood of it being severe. And it appears that it reduces the likelihood of both.
That's correct, and which is really positive, because the one thing I think everyone is worried about is, will it also increase hospital or decrease hospitalizations in patients? And it looks like it does that.
Sure. So we use the term, I shouldn't say we, I'm not a part of this. I'm not a part of the vaccination community. I'm certainly no infectious disease expert. So the experts in the field use the term efficacy to describe basically the end goal of the vaccine is to have efficacy, and efficacy measures the reduction of the risk of illness. So when they say that the Pfizer vaccine, I think the initial number was 90, and then as they imported more data, it actually improved to 94 or 95% efficacy. Basically, that means that if you get the vaccine, it reduces the risk of infection from COVID-19 by 90 or 95%. Which is an amazing number when you consider, Dr. Eberlein already mentioned, so the last season's flu vaccine was only about 40 to 45% effective, or had 40 to 45% efficacy.
And our best vaccines are running, the classic vaccines, the MMR, varicella vaccines are in the 90 percentile range as well. So this is right in line with with the best vaccines we have.
Yeah, which is amazing. And if you, what's really interesting is that the FDA, when they started developing the benchmarks for these pharmaceutical companies to reach, they said, basically, we're looking for a vaccine that's at least 50%, has an efficacy of at least 50%. So for multiple, actually, companies or multiple vaccines to show greater than 90% efficacy is amazing. And it really, to me, especially when you see two, I think like when you see 2 mRNA vaccines that both have, similar safety profiles and similar efficacy, that to me, we're talking now 44,000 in the Pfizer. I don't remember how many are in the Moderna, but tens of thousands. And now you're starting to stack up to big numbers. Mm-hmm. And so any hesitation about, well, these studies aren't big enough, or it's not enough people, that kind of stuff. When you start adding them up, that gives you, to me, it gives me a little bit more, makes me a little more comfortable.
For sure. It's not just the Pfizer anymore utilizing this technology. You've got others doing it. So you're really doubling, tripling. And at last I heard, there's somewhere around 100 different people or companies working towards a vaccine, and a lot of them are utilizing mRNA. So absolutely, you're looking at big numbers across the world working on this.
Well, and it's good that there are multiple candidates, lots of candidates, because with the number of people that need to get this vaccine, we need to have multiple companies actually working on it so that there's lots of different options just simply for availability purposes.
Absolutely. And some of them, like when we talked about storage, here in the United States and in the United Kingdom, we're in relatively wealthy countries. When you start getting into other countries that don't have the resources we do, that cold storage is going to be a real issue for them. And so hopefully, ultimately, development of this sort of vaccine for areas around the world that don't have that sort of support.
Right. Now, with this study, they talk about adverse events, and really the ones that had been reported were quite moderate. So, and not unexpected. Again, like Dr. Eberlein mentioned, what they found is localized pain at the injection site. Well, that's pretty obvious. Fatigue, headache, chills, muscle and joint pain, fever. So really your standard responses to that inflammatory process that's going on when it's, your body is seeing something that it needs to attack, and that's what it does. But with that, within the last couple of days, the FDA has talked about the recommendation to stagger vaccination within a group of people, like an agency, to prevent, because for some people, that adverse event, that side effect, so to speak, might make you uncomfortable enough that you don't want to come to work. And so the recommendation is that maybe you vaccinate a portion of your staff one day, and then kind of stagger it so that you don't end up with everybody having chills and fever the next day. Although it's unlikely that 100% of the recipients would have that adverse event. It looks like it's more like 10 to 15%. So,
but on the flip side, from a personnel standpoint, if you had 10 to 15% out, because we're asking people to not come to work if they have these symptoms, and you're not going to be able to guarantee that it was from the vaccine, because what if you were unlucky and happened to be coming down with COVID that day? So you're going to have to assume that these patients could have COVID, or these employees. And so then you would be looking at 10 to 15% of your staff out that day, which would be a real impact. Yeah,
definitely. So that creates some logistical hurdles on the administrator side, those that will do the administration of the vaccine, to try to stagger it in that way. What I also found very interesting is that as part of I don't know if it's an FDA requirement or was part of the study, and that's a normal thing, but they're required to report any adverse event that occurred 2% in 2% or more of patients, and there were only 2. So headache occurred in 2% of those that received the vaccine, and fatigue occurred in 3.8% of those that received the vaccine. There were no other adverse events that occurred more at 2% or more than 2% of the time. So that's good to see as well, that there's not just like one thing that's happening to 50% of the recipients. So a concern, obviously, that's been voiced has been the speed of the approval. If it is approved, and again, I think it's on track to be approved either December 10th or before that. So, Dr. Eberlein, when it comes to the speed of approval, or the speed at which we've reached this point, at least, can you comment on any of the concerns that people might have about that?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that you have to realize is that this is not brand new technology, as we mentioned prior. We've been working towards this type of process for a long time. A lot of companies have. Have we done it on a pathogen like this? No, but there are companies that have been working on mRNA vaccines for fighting cancer and lots of other things. So the process was known. the other thing that you have to realize with these vaccines is they're extremely expensive to come to market. And one of the things that we had talked about, that had been talked about before, was that without government support, these companies are not going to take this investment risk that could run billions of dollars. And if initially, if the pandemic burned out, which was talk initially, obviously that didn't come to fruition, unfortunately, they would have been stuck with billions of dollars down the drain in R&D. So to limit their financial risk made them more willing to take this on. And when you look at the collective scientific community working on something like this, the number of hours of scientists studying this and working on this, it is amazing. Truly, this has been a global effort, and the amount that we learned about this virus early on, kudos to all the scientists around the world that worked so hard and tirelessly to get the genome done and get the testing protocols done, and then working on this part of it. And so when you really look at all the work that has been done, I don't think this is something that has been rushed. I think this is, so far from what I can tell, this has been very deliberate and is following good, solid science.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about, and I think I've heard you use the term about the world brain. I've read, even locally, we've had people that, researchers that have stopped doing their normal research and shifted their focus to COVID. All over the world that's happening. And so yeah. I think, if you at the end of the day, you look at the number of brain hours, so to speak, that have been put into understanding the virus and developing the vaccine, it very well may end up being the most brain hours ever. It's just, and that's what allowed you to shrink the timeline, right? It's clearly been at the top of the list of almost every major research group out there, and there's the significant financial outlay for the companies that are trying to bring these vaccines to market, but they also had a significant upside too, right? If they came to market before anybody else, or those kinds of things, so they had big risk but also big reward. Another thing that I thought was very interesting, actually, real quickly, you had mentioned the government support. So I don't think Pfizer actually received any dollars as part of like Operation Warp Speed or anything like that for the development. But what they did get was a guaranteed order of 100 million doses, a guaranteed order from the federal government of 100 million doses to the tune of $1.95 billion. So with, I come from a family of my dad's a business owner for many, many years. My brother owns a business, and knowing you have guaranteed orders will make you much more likely to work on and produce the product that if otherwise you were kind of like, God, I hope this sells, it's a big difference. And so that has really made a difference for not just Pfizer, but for many of these other organizations, some of them who actually got upfront money to help in the development. So the risk was lessened, and it made, and that is probably part why there's so many candidates out there. The other thing that I found actually while doing the research on this is that FDA review timelines had actually shrunk pre-COVID. So if we go back, several years, let's say, the FDA would take maybe up to 2 years to review data and approve a vaccine or a drug or something like that. Sorry about that sound there. And pre-COVID, within the last year before that, they had actually shrunk their timelines by about 50%. So we were already on a shortened timeline. The FDA was more efficient even pre-COVID. And so, it really isn't this rushed process that I think some people think it is. And the other thing too is, this isn't our first pandemic actually, right? So you and I both worked through H1N1, which certainly wasn't anywhere near what we're experiencing today with COVID-19. But if you actually look back to the review cycles for again, vaccines and therapeutics and stuff back then, and other pandemics, the first SARS, MERS, those kinds of things, you actually saw similar review cycles, similar shortened review cycles for those types of things. So that, again, nothing new here. This isn't something that just popped up because of COVID.
Yeah, we saw it for Ebola therapeutics as well when that was coming down the line too.
Sure. So the timeline of this Pfizer vaccine from an availability standpoint, distribution standpoint, can we talk a little bit about that? So we see that there's a lot of doses out there, and actually it will require a couple doses per person, right?
Yeah, it's supposed to be 2 doses for at least the Pfizer vaccine, and typical of a lot of vaccines, about 28 days to a month apart. That doesn't mean that if you're 40 days out, it doesn't work anymore. You just want to have them separated in enough time. So I would imagine that most people will get the first one, and then 1 to 2 months down the road, you'd get the booster, similar to other boosters that we get, just to make sure the immune system is still primed for that pathogen.
And when it comes to who is eligible to get the vaccine and when, there was actually a meeting yesterday. Actually, I think that's maybe on my next slide here. So healthcare workers in long-term care are in what's considered Tier 1A. And we talk about more about that in the next slide. But Pfizer has said that they expect to be able to manufacture 1.3 billion doses per year, starting sometime next year as they get their process ramped up. But even if you think about that, that's not enough for what the world needs. So again,
no, especially when you have to divide it by 2 because everyone needs 2 of them.
Yep. So speaking of that Tier 1A and who gets the vaccine and when, so there's an advisory committee, a CDC advisory committee on immunization practices, also known as ACIP, who have met regularly, actually. And if you search their name, you will find meeting minutes and agenda items and things like that. They met yesterday, and it was a public meeting. I guess I didn't know that. Otherwise, I might have tried to have it playing somewhere. But they met yesterday, and they made their formal recommendation to the CDC. Now, what happens from there is that the CDC director has the ability or has the option of accepting those recommendations or not. And then and it's expected that the CDC director will accept the recommendations from ACIP. And then those will be distributed to the states. And then the states have a choice about adopting those, correct?
That is correct. And the state of Wisconsin appears at this point in the last meetings I've been at to be right in line with the CDC recommendations. It does not look like any variance. So healthcare workers, including EMS and long-term care, will be in the first tier.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a big thing for us in EMS to recognize is that I was looking back at the old the minutes and the PowerPoint presentations from previous ACIP meetings, and I looked at the meetings in November. That's where I got these images from. So again, phase 1A. So the first group to get it will be healthcare workers and long-term care residents. And then I think the staff are included in either healthcare workers or part of that long-term care piece. And I, to be honest with you, having been in the business long enough, I hear healthcare workers and I have to ask, like, is EMS, are we considered healthcare workers this time? And sure enough, we are. And I think that's a big deal on a federal level to be recognized as healthcare workers, because that is what we do. We do other things, but we certainly provide healthcare. And it's nice to be recognized as part of healthcare. So ACIP was estimating about 21 million healthcare providers in the United States and 3 million long-term care facility residents. So about in 1A, they expect about 24 million Americans to be potential recipients of the initial vaccine.
And it looks like from Pfizer's notes that they've sent out that they would have enough vaccine produced by the end of 2020 to cover that group in the prior slides.
Which is good to hear. Plus, depending on Moderna's EUA application, you may even see additional vaccine available on top of what Pfizer can produce. So you might even see 1B maybe starting to get access to vaccine either towards the end of the year or maybe early next year, which is great.
So Nick, there's one other question that gets asked a lot about the vaccine is, if I've had COVID or thought I had it, should I get the vaccine? And I think that prior slide with the antibody numbers tells you the answer. Because for one, we don't know how long your natural immunity lasts to this. And even if it does, you are still not as protected as you do with the vaccine, with those antibody levels. So absolutely, I think those that have had the vaccine or had the illness should still get the vaccine.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and not something that I had actually researched myself, or I assume there may be some data out there, but maybe not about that yet. So, but given, like you said, given the recognition of increased immunity with the vaccine, it seems plausible that would be a good choice. All right, so I think we can maybe move on to the part where we talk a little bit about the myths of the vaccine and maybe even COVID-19 a little bit in and of itself. So, what's the first myth? Maybe we should tackle the 5G myth.
The 5G myth? Yeah. So you hear about the 5G is what's causing COVID or driving it. I find this to be interesting as, the coincidence of things, as they start rolling out 5G networks, we happen to have a pandemic. There has never been a relationship between a pandemic and radio waves. The radio waves would not affect a virus. And there are lots of countries that don't have 5G that still have the pandemic. So I hope we can at least lay that to rest in our area. One, we don't have a lot of 5G here either. So, and we still have the coronavirus, which we can talk about in a minute as well.
Yeah. So what coronavirus are you talking about? All I know about is this flu.
Oh, that is right. So there are other, coronavirus in and of itself is not unique. We have many of us have come in contact with other coronaviruses if you've ever had a common cold. So the virus family has been known to science for some time. Yeah,
well, so COVID-19 doesn't actually exist, does it? It's just
that's right.
Other cold or flu, right?
Well, and I hope that everyone that's working in our healthcare system now and in EMS has seen enough of these patients to realize that this is not the common flu. And you can ask those that have had it. Many of them have had very rough courses from this, and this is not the common flu. So this is a unique pathogen. It has been isolated, it has been studied, probably more so than just about any other virus at this point with the amount of work that's gone into it. So yes, COVID-19 does exist. It is there. And actually, masks do help to prevent the spread, and that is being proven again and again as well. A recent study by Mayo Clinic came out showing that masking yourself and those around you can greatly reduce the spread of this pathogen.
Right, and I think it's incredibly important to recognize that there's an argument to be made about focusing only on the negative part of COVID-19, right? Only on the deaths and the hospitalizations. And some will claim that it's not, they believe that COVID exists, but that it's overhyped. And unfortunately, I think what happens is that in your small group, if you don't have someone who has been significantly affected by it, it's hard to understand that on a much larger scale, 10% hospitalization, and I don't know what the number is today, but it's been hovering around 10% of people that get COVID-19 are hospitalized.
Yep.
That has a huge impact on the health system and anyone with a medical condition, not just those that are being infected with COVID-19. And if you haven't seen that firsthand, I think it's hard for people to really grasp that concept.
I think that's true. They don't see that, on a normal day, we don't have a lot of extra capacity in our healthcare systems. There's not a lot of fat there. And so we're able to take care of patients on a routine day-to-day basis. We're able to handle all the emergent care that comes through. But when you start adding, I think the last time I heard we had like 50 some in our local hospital that has 200 beds. So that's almost a quarter. So that really starts to put a strain on a system that is otherwise doing just fine. And people don't realize that because they don't see it. And plus, I've seen other people talk about, hospitals look so empty right now. Well, that's because we don't let in a lot of visitors anymore. We used to have, 4 or 5 people per family would come in and visit someone. And if you've been to a hospital lately, the reason the waiting rooms are empty is because you're not allowed back, and that's to reduce the spread. And so, yes, in the areas that most people see of the hospital, it does look a little empty, but it is not empty up on the inpatient floors and is not empty in the emergency departments itself.
Well, and actually, speaking of being empty, that's been a side effect of the pandemic is, and we've seen this all over the country, is people not seeking out even emergency health care for the fear of COVID-19. And it's an understandable fear, but that has led to an additional burden on the healthcare system with people that if they would have come in a couple months ago and gotten their preventive care, they wouldn't be in the emergency room today with their exacerbation of whatever condition it was they should have addressed 2 months ago. And again, like when 90% of people who are affected by COVID-19 do fairly well, right? Even those that don't come into the hospital, like you said, some of them have a really, really rough course. And we're not talking about the elderly. We are talking about a lot of people in a lot of different age groups. But if the chances of getting COVID-19 and not ending up in the hospital are 90% versus the 10% of actually ending up in the hospital, it's a lot less likely for me as just Joe Schmo to know someone who has had to go into the hospital or even died from COVID. So again, in my mind, it might be hard for me to understand on the larger scale how this really is impacting the communities at large.
Yeah, for sure. And you see it with all sorts of care that we're doing. In fact, today I saw some numbers from the cardiac arrest registry that out of hospital cardiac arrests have gone up. More people are dying at home with cardiac arrest. The only logical explanation for that I can see is that they are delaying care, and partially probably because they're scared of coming into the hospital to seek care of COVID. And that's tragic because these are patients that oftentimes we can save. In addition, the mental health calls have gone way up, and as everyone's heard, opiate calls have gone up, and so this has been impactful across the spectrum of disease, which is really startling and frightening at the same time.
So we've strayed a little bit from the initial point, which was that addressing the idea that COVID doesn't exist. But I think there's a really important point to make here, and that is why everything that we've just talked about in the last couple of minutes emphasizes the need to end this pandemic sooner rather than later, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
The sooner that the sooner we can gain immunity to the virus, and the sooner we can regain a better sense of normalcy, we hopefully will see a reduction in some of these occurrences that are happening outside of the pandemic itself, outside of the virus infecting people, that is causing burden on people and the healthcare system alike. So I think I'm glad we kind of strayed from that, because that's a whole nother reason for us to do our due diligence, to understand the vaccine, and to make our decision about whether or not we want it. And hopefully knowing more about it will make us feel more comfortable about getting it. And then also being that sounding board for the people that we know who might come to us and say, what do you think of this vaccine? I have already been asked several times from friends and family about the vaccine. And I'm a paramedic, I'm not a vaccine expert, but I'm the healthcare expert in my small group, because I'm the only real healthcare provider within my family group. And so they're coming to me, and I'm sure that's happening to other paramedics, other EMS people out there. And so I think that's a big part of why we talked about doing this, Dr. Eberlein, is to get that information out so that they can make an informed decision for themselves, but also to help inform others about the decision that they're going to make.
Absolutely. And, you know, like you said, the sooner that we get this this pandemic over, the better for all of us, economically, socially, healthcare wise. It's a big deal. And so, and the vaccine is how we're going to get there. And the science is sound on this vaccine. It makes sense. And I think that hopefully we've kind of educated everyone on that fact, and hopefully they can make a good informed decision. And personally, I hope their good informed decision is that they realize that it's safe and that we are going to be okay. You know, looking at the evidence that you presented with the trials, I think you've made a very good argument that this vaccine is safe.
So one last myth I think we should tackle, because if we don't, someone's going to say we were paid by him to ignore him, and that's Mr. Bill Gates.
Yes. I'm cashing my check tomorrow, actually.
Right. Yeah, this is my temporary home. I'm moving into the mansion next week.
Yeah. I took the yacht. He offered me instead.
Okay.
Yes.
So personally, I'm a nerd, and I actually, interestingly, I think Bill Gates and Microsoft, early in their rise to power, they were a horrible company. Actually, they were ruthless in their competition practices. And in some ways, some would argue that what they did was illegal, although they had an antitrust suit against them and all sorts of stuff. But interestingly, I feel like the things that I've read about Bill Gates and what he's done with all of his money is pretty amazing about, you know, and really lots of efforts in looking out for the public health, and even more so than the public health, the public health of vulnerable populations, and giving money with nothing coming back in return other than seeing vulnerable populations do better. So honestly, I don't know a whole lot about the myth and what he stands to gain from this, but what do you know about Bill Gates and
Well, the one I heard was that there's a computer chip within the vaccine, and I think that came from, there was a project that I believe was sponsored by the Bill Gates Foundation, and it basically was in a vaccine or injection for utilization in third world countries where you don't have the ability to do medical records to know who got a vaccine. There was some sort of, it sounded like a temporary dye that would last about 5 years that you could look at like a temporary tattoo under the skin after you got the vaccine. And you could shine a UV light on it, I believe, and you would see that patient got the vaccine. So you didn't waste resources and vaccinate people that didn't need it. Theoretically, it seems like a great idea, but it has nothing to do with microchip tracking.
And I don't think it really had anything to do with COVID-19 either, right? It was like,
no, it did not. No, this was a couple of years ago. Simply, they were looking at a way to track who got vaccines in countries that, quite frankly, don't have the resources to track.
Yeah, and again, I suppose if you're, we know what we know, and oftentimes we, if we haven't, and I certainly haven't been, and I don't know what it's like, but if other areas of the world don't have the same resources and systems that we have in place, and technology may be the answer in some cases, and that's, to me, sounds like what it is.
Yeah, seems to be, yes. I don't think it is a COVID-19 conspiracy.
Sure. I think there was one other one, a chimera, the mixture of basically turning us into a mixture of human and animal, which interestingly, so Z-Dog MD, I'm just going to drop his name. He did a video about this, and he actually said we are chimeras. Like, we have actually had animal DNA get taken up into our whatever, and through the years, so we kind of already are chimeras. So there can't be really any too big concern. But that's not even a concern here anyway, right? Because the DNA, the nucleus isn't even involved.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a messenger RNA. It's a temporary message that the cell uses to encode proteins. in the cytoplasm, does not cross into the nucleus to the DNA, and after it's translated into a protein, it's just broken down into its nucleotides and reused.
So this is basically
not as
like,
a whole. It's parts are reused for other synthesis.
I'm going to expose us for how old we are. This is basically like Inspector Gadget and the self-destructing message in every episode, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Does not
I literally just thought of that, and I feel like now I should have included that in the imagery of that we've had in the background here. So that's everything, Dr. Eberlein, that I had on the agenda for today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, other than I hope this answers some people's questions and they are able to make a informed decision and approach this informed and educated on the process, and can help others with questions they have.
Perfect. Again, I'd like to thank everybody who's taken the time to watch this. If you are within our system, stay tuned for, not in the video here, but there will be some additional information where we will ask you to submit questions that, if there are enough questions and we have access to others, we will either do another video with Dr. Eberlein and myself, or potentially try to include somebody like Dr. Kowalski in a future podcast that would further discuss the vaccines that are out there and then answer any questions that you might have. So thanks again for everybody taking the time to watch. Thank you very much for Dr. Eberlein for your time.
Absolutely. Hope this helps. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah.